easy to like, and there's some people that's difficult to like, right? There's just people that are difficult to live with. Can I get a witness? And hopefully you're not sitting beside them, but there's just a lot of people that's difficult to live with. And so we've all found ourselves dealing with some of those difficult people, and we've thought, man, he or she are talented and they're gifted, but man, they're sure hard to work with. They're brilliant, but man, they don't get along with anybody. And so we all deal with those kind of people. And so tonight I want to not introduce, but I want to get into chapter 1 in the book. And we're going to be talking over the next few weeks about these principles. But there's questions that John Maxwell talks about when he talks about your relationships with people. Now, and these 5 questions are this. Number 1 is the readiness question. And now I'm going to give you all the questions, and then we're going to talk about number 1 tonight. We won't finish it, but we'll get in and begin number 1. The readiness question is this: are we prepared for relationships? Are we prepared? Do we have the people skills to help establish relationships? So that's the readiness question. Number 2 is the connection question. Are we willing to focus on others? If we're going to be connected with other people, are we willing to focus on others? Then there's the trust question. Can we build mutual trust? Because if you're going to have a good relationship with somebody, you've got to build mutual trust, right? Then there's the investment question. Are we willing to invest in others? And then there's the synergy question. Can we create a win-win relationship? And so I want to go back to the first question, and that is the readiness question. Are we prepared for relationships? I think there are several things we've got to have in our life, personal life, to answer that question. Are we ready for relationships? Are we prepared for relationships? And so with each one of these questions comes some principles. Okay? Tonight we'll get through 3 or 4 of the principles, and then next week we'll really talk about the 5th one, Lord willing. We'll see how far we get. But the first principle is this. It's called the lens principle. LEN''S, the lens principle. And the question is this, or here's the principle. Who we are determines how we see others. Who we are determines how we see others. Because the way we see others tends to be a reflection of ourselves. For instance, if I am a trusting person, then I tend to see others as trustworthy. If I am a critical person, I will tend to see others as critical. If I'm a caring person, I will tend to see others as caring or compassionate. And so the lens principle states who we are determines how we see others. I want you to understand this. You cannot separate your identity from your perspective. You cannot separate your identity from your perspective. Who you are determines the way you see everything. I mean, if you're a critical person, you see everything through a critical lens, right? Anybody know of anybody that's critical by nature? You know, they always see the glass what? Half empty, right? They don't see it as half full. They see it as half empty. And you know, they have a difficult time seeing the good in things or in people. Because that's the lens principle. Who we are determines how we see others. Your personality comes through when you talk about others and you interact with them. Your personality comes through. So just remember, you may not be able to change the world that you see around you, but you can change what you see within you. And I think that's very important. And I think that's very, very important for us to understand. You may not be able to change the world that you see around you, but you can change what you see within you. And we'll talk about another principle that kind of lends to that here in a moment. Now, there are many things that contribute to who you are. Some of those things may be genetic, and you cannot change them. However, for the most part, we can change a lot of things about ourselves, right? Now, there are some things, sorry, it's just in the genes, right? And you may not be able to change that. But there's a lot of things about me that I can change if I so choose. There's a lot of things about me that I don't like, that I need to change. Now, you may say the same thing about yourself. There may be a lot of things about you that you don't like. What can we do about those things? We can change many of those things, right? You see, we can choose how we will respond to our experiences. We have limited control over our experiences, but we have complete control over our attitudes toward those experiences. Does that make sense? Again, that's the lens principle. Now, our attitude, our choices, and our friends can affect how we look at things. That's the reason it's important who we hang around, right? That's important to know who our friends are, because our friends can affect us. Our friends can affect our attitude. Those of us who have kids, how many times have we told them, you need to be careful who you hang around, right? Because their friends can affect them. But we as adults, that same principle applies to us as well. Even though we're not teenagers anymore, that same thing applies to us. Those people that we hang around affects us. So we need to be very careful. Charlie Tremendous Jones, many of you have probably heard of him. He said this, and I quote, "The difference between who you are today and who you will be in 5 years will be the people you spend time with and the books that you read." Who you will be in 5 years is determined by who you hang around and what books you will read. Who you associate with and what you're going to put into your mind. That's going to determine who you are in 5, 10, 15 years. So the question to ask ourselves is this: what is my perception of others? Are you critical toward others? Then you're probably a critical person. If you're compassionate toward others, then you're probably a pretty caring and compassionate person. And we could go on and on. I mean, if you trust people, then you're probably a trustworthy person yourself. So again, that lens principle states this: who we are determines how we see others. So ask yourself the question, how do I see others? Because that's probably who you are. That's the lens principle. So what is my perception of others? The second principle is this: not only do you have the lens principle, but number two, you have the mirror principle. And this is crucial. The mirror principle states this: the first person we must examine is ourselves. The first person we must examine is ourselves. In other words, the first thing we need to do is look in the what? Mirror. You remember my sermon several months ago, but we talked about the Word of God being the mirror, right? That's the reason many times we don't want to look deeply into the Word, because the Word reveals who we really are, right? Because it is a mirror, particularly that when you flip it around and it's that magnified mirror, it really shows up close, right? Who you are, and it shows all the flaws and all those things. But sometimes what we need to do, we need to look in the mirror. We need to examine ourselves and understand the first person we must examine is ourselves. The problem is not always with everybody else. That's another principle within itself that we'll talk about in a few weeks. It's called the Bob principle. If Bob has a problem with Sally, and Bob has a problem with Joe, and Bob has a problem with Sue, and Bob has a problem with Joey, maybe Bob needs to look in the mirror. Because you know who the problem probably is? Bob. So the Bob principle and the mirror principle goes hand in hand, and we'll get to the Bob principle a little later. But the mirror principle states the first person we must examine is ourselves. I think we would all agree with this. Coping with a difficult person is always a problem, especially if the difficult person happens to be you. Coping with difficult people is always a problem, especially if the difficult person happens to be you. So sometimes we need to look in the mirror and realize the reason we're having so many difficulties is because we are the difficult person. People who often experience relational difficulties. They're tempted to look at everyone but themselves to explain the problem. It's kind of like we were talking about this in our D group tonight. It's kind of like looking at the speck in your brother's eyes, and you have a what? A plank. You have a 2x4, right? In your own eyes. And so people who often experience relational difficulties are tempted to look at everyone else but themselves to explain the problem. I'm going to give you a few statements. And these next few statements are not meant to fall into the false theology of the self-esteem movement today. Okay? So I don't want you to categorize me into that movement, all right? However, people who cannot get along with others often are having inner turmoil themselves. And the reason they can't get along with other people is because there's inner turmoil in their own life, in their own heart. And so consider these truths that we must learn about ourselves. And let me give you 3 truths here that I think it's important that we learn about ourselves. Number 1, the first person I must know is myself. Sometimes we need to get to know ourselves a little bit. And maybe that would help us to realize maybe we are that difficult person. Human nature seems to endow people with the ability to size up everybody in the world but themselves, right? We want to judge everybody else, but we don't want to look in the mirror and we don't want to see ourselves for who we really are. The second truth is this. First of all, the first person I must know is myself. Second of all, the first person to cause me problems is myself. I've learned in my life, I'm 54 years old. I've learned in my life, typically when I have a lot of problems, the problem is because of John David Sexton. And I'm probably the only one like that in this room tonight. But when I look in the mirror, many times it's me. It's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. You know, I'm the problem. I'm the issue. And so the first person to cause me problems is myself. I mean, if we could kick the person responsible for most of our troubles, we wouldn't be able to sit down for weeks because it's us many times. We must look in the mirror and we must get honest with ourselves. If we're going to have the right kind of relationships, then we must look in the mirror and we must get honest with ourselves. And I believe this was part of the problem with the elder brother in Luke chapter 15. I don't have time to get into it, but his problem with the prodigal son was really a reflection of his own problems in Luke 15. And so the first person I must know is myself. The first person to cause me problems is myself. And the third truth is this. The first person I must change is who? Myself. The first person I must change is myself. In other words, we must stop blaming others and take an honest look at ourselves. How many of you know people that love to play the blame game? And they blame everybody on their problems and their troubles. By the way, that's been around for a little while. I think you can go back to the beginning of time, right? In the Garden of Eden, you know, Adam and Eve began blaming each other. Then they blamed the snake. You know, they played that blame game. So it's been going on since the beginning of creation. And so we've got to stop blaming others and we've got to take an honest look at ourselves. Because if we want better relationships with others, whether it's home, work, church, anywhere else, we've got to look in the mirror and we've got to start working on ourselves. Because we can't control what everybody else does. But we have a little say in what we do. And we have a little say in how we relate with people, how we love people as Christ would love them. Go back to the acrostic of church. You know, they got to be redemptive. They got to be Christ-like. And so sometimes we need to evaluate our relationships with others in light of that. And if we want better relationships, then sometimes we need to look in the mirror and we need to start working on ourselves. And so here's the question on the mirror principle that we've got to ask ourselves. It's this. I must ask myself, have I examined myself and taken responsibility for who I am? That's the question in the mirror principle that we've got to ask. Have I examined myself? Have I looked in the mirror? Have I examined myself and have I taken responsibility for who I am? Or are we playing the blame game? Right? And so that's the mirror principle. Number 3. The third principle is this. It's the pain principle. I have seen this principle at work a lot of times. Here's what the pain principle states. Hurting people hurt people and are easily hurt by them. Hurting people hurt people and are easily hurt by them. How many times have people done something to you that hurt you? Raise your hand if it's been you. You've been hurt by somebody. I want you to remember this. Next time somebody hurts you, remember this. The reason they hurt you is probably because they are hurting. I promise you, almost in every case, when somebody is evil and they're acting like the devil and they hurt you, it's probably because they're having some difficulties in their life and they are hurting themselves. Because hurting people hurt people and they're easily hurt by them. That's the pain principle. We've seen this in church. I've seen this so many times, even in the 15 years at Crosspointe. I've seen it where people hurt people. And almost every time it's because they are hurting themselves. Did Jesus ever get hurt? Pretty often, right? How did Jesus respond to those that hurt him? What did he do at the cross? Father, what? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was hurt, and he was hurt by people who were hurt. And so in dealing with others, you need to keep in mind 4 truths that I want to give you very quickly in the pain principle. Number 1, there are many hurting people. I think we understand that. In this world, there are many hurting people. There's people here tonight sitting right here in this auditorium, many that's in the fellowship hall where there's food, where all the parents of teens and teenagers are meeting tonight. That's the reason many of them are over there instead of in here tonight. But in this building tonight, there are many hurting people. Many of them. It does not take a psychiatrist to figure out that there's a lot of hurting people. Number 2, yes, there's a lot of hurting people, but number 2, those hurting people often hurt people. Those hurting people often hurt people. Hurting people tend to lash out. Hurting people tend to do the most damage because they're hurting. They feel like it's their responsibility to go ahead and hurt somebody else. Might as well, if I'm hurting, everybody else might be hurt, should be hurting with me, right? And so that's their attitude many times. And so what do? If they're hurting, many times they lash out and hurt people. If someone has a splinter and he allows it to remain there, what happens to that finger? Becomes swollen, gets infected, right? If you don't remove it. If you don't remove it, then another person kind of brushes up against it, and they brush up against that splinter that's been there, that's infected, that's swollen, what happens? They brush up against it and you're going to scream, that hurt, right? You hurt me. But the reality is the problem is not with a person who innocently bumped the finger. It's with a person who has the splinter that has neglected to remove the splinter. So when you're hurting and somebody rubs you the wrong way and you lash out at them, the problem is not the person who rubs you the wrong way. The problem is you didn't deal with the splinter. You didn't remove the splinter, and you got hurt, and you didn't deal with the hurt, and now you want to lash out, and now you want to blame people because they're hurting you. But the problem is you were hurt, but you didn't remove the splinter. Maybe you got hurt and you didn't forgive. Maybe you're holding a grudge. Maybe you're holding bitterness in your heart. And now because you're hurt and because you're bitter, maybe you're angry, then it don't take much for somebody to say something to you that just lights your fire, that ticks you off. And then you begin to lash out. Why? Because you're hurting. Hurting people hurt people. Hurting people tend to overreact, right? Because they're hurting. Just like that splinter. Somebody rubs up against you, and it hurts. You tend to, it hurts. You want to scream. You want to get mad maybe. Many times we overreact. We over-exaggerate. Maybe we overprotect. That's the way hurting people do. And so as you interact with others, remember this. Anytime a person's response is larger than the issue at hand, the response is almost always about something else, not what's at hand. Almost every time the issue is not what it's at hand, it's something else. Because they're hurting. And hurting people are going to lash out. So remember, when somebody lashes out at you, remember it's probably because they're hurting. And maybe we should respond like Christ. And maybe say, hey, man, I know you're mad at me. I know you lashed out at me, but, and I'm okay with that. But is there something that's bothering you? Is there a reason why? Are you hurting? Are you struggling? And maybe we can help that individual. But our first reaction is what? When somebody lashes out at us and they do something that's hurtful, what's our first response? Vengeance is mine and I'll repay, right? Saith John David Sexton. That's our first reaction. That's our first response, that vengeance is ours. But maybe we need to think about how would Jesus respond? Jesus dealt with a lot of hurting people, right? By the way, many of them lashed out at Jesus too, right? And so maybe we need to look at how Jesus responded to them. But just remember, those hurting people are often hurt by people. And then the fourth truth that I want you to keep in mind is this. Those hurting people often hurt themselves. Hurting people often hurt themselves. George Herbert once said this, and I quote, "He who cannot forgive others breaks the bridge over which he must pass himself." He who cannot forgive others breaks the bridge over which he must pass himself. Such was the case in the Old Testament of Ahithophel. Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba. We know the story of David and Bathsheba, right? But Ahithophel was the grandfather of Bathsheba who could not forgive King David. And eventually, remember what happened to Ahithophel? He committed suicide. Those hurting people often hurt themselves. And so that's the pain principle. Remember this. Remember that people who have not gotten past their hurt tend to react differently than healthy people. If they've not gotten over their hurt, they're going to react differently than healthy people. And so here's something that maybe will help you. If you find yourself dealing with a hurting person, this is what you'll need to do. Let me give you 3 things that I think, or actually 5 things that I think you'll need to do. Number 1, when somebody that is hurting, they lash out and hurt you. Number 1, don't take it personally. Okay, and I think these are 5 great truths that will really help us, because here's the bottom line. We all deal with these kind of people. Those who lash out that hurt us. Again, because they're hurting. So when that takes place, don't take it personally. Hurting people are going to find something wrong when there is nothing wrong. So you cannot take it personally. Number 2, look beyond the person for the problem. And remember, the reason they're hurting you is probably because they are hurting. So look beyond the person for the problem. Look beyond the hurtful actions and try to see what's causing him or her pain. And be the mature Christian, and it will be worth it for you, for them, and for the kingdom. And so number 1, don't take it personally. Number 2, look beyond the person for the problem. Number 3, you got to look beyond the situation. And remember this, that it's not what happens to you, it's what happens in you that really matters and will affect you for the long haul. It's not what happens to you, but it's what happens in you as a result of that that's going to affect you for the long haul. And so number 3, look beyond the situation. And then number 4, do not add to their hurt. Remember, they're hurting, so don't add to their hurt. We want to meet pain with pain, right? We want to meet fire with fire. Vengeance is mine. You know what happens in that situation? Nobody gains. Nobody gains. But we've all done it. Maybe we regret it later, but in the end, nobody gains when that takes place. And so don't add to their hurt. And then number 5, help them find help. Knowing that they're hurting, help them find help. Because our goal should be God's glory. Our goal should be the welfare of the other person. By the way, they may not want help, and that's okay. They may not want help, but we must extend a genuine, loving hand to help them, whether they want it or not. Heap coals of kindness upon their head. And when you are hurting, there's nothing that comforts one like a good friend. And that's exactly what a person needs when they're hurting. And they may lash out, they may be ugly, and they may hurt you. But ultimately, what a hurting person needs, they need somebody to love them. They need somebody to listen to them. Yeah, they may have done something to you that hurts you, but probably what they need is just somebody that will love on them and try to encourage them and try to help them. Because when you're hurting, there's nothing like the comfort of a good friend. So the question we must ask ourselves on the pain principle is this: do I hurt people, or am I too easily hurt by them? That's the question we've got to ask ourselves. Do I hurt people? Do I say hurtful things? And if we do, it's probably because we're what? We're hurting ourselves. So do I hurt people, or am I easily hurt by them? You know, there's some people who are just very easily offended, right? I mean, you can't even look at them wrong because they're going to be offended. And so I think we've got to ask ourselves these questions when it comes to this pain principle. Do I hurt people, or am I too easily hurt by them? And so under this readiness question, the readiness question simply being, are we prepared for relationships? We've got to look at the lens principle. Who we are determines how we see others. We got to look the mirror principle. The first person we must examine is ourselves. We got to look in the mirror. And then the pain principle, realizing hurting people hurt people and are easily hurt by them. And then the fourth principle is this, and this is probably as far as we'll go tonight. The fourth principle is the hammer principle. The hammer principle. Alexander McLaren once said this: if you could win the world, melt it. Don't hammer it. If you could win the world, melt it and don't hammer it. Someone else said, never use a hammer to swat a fly off of somebody's head. Never use a hammer to swat a fly off of someone's head. I want you to look in the Bible, in the book of Proverbs, because Solomon talks a lot about our words. He talks a lot, as well as James, about the tongue. And so I want you to look with me in some familiar verses, Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1. Because the Bible says a lot about hasty and harsh words. And Solomon said this in Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turneth away what? Wrath. But grievous words stir up what? Anger. A soft answer turns away wrath. But grievous words stir up anger. Look with me in Proverbs 16 and verse 24. Pleasant words are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. In other words, that's good, right? Pleasant words are as an honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. Look at Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 20. Seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? This is pretty blunt. There is more hope of a fool than of him. There's more hope for a fool than of him. Seest thou a man that is hasty in his words? By the way, James talks about that, does he not? Be quick to what? To hear. Slow to what? Speak. If you tend to be a hammer, some of us may tend to be a hammer when it comes to these things. And if you tend to be a hammer, here's a few tips for you. Number one, get the total picture. Get the total picture. Don't jump to conclusions. How many times are we guilty of jumping to conclusions when we haven't heard the entire story? Hear people out. Listen to them. But how many times have we jumped to conclusions? And we got the wrong impression about a certain individual because we jumped to conclusions? And we didn't hear the entire story? By the way, there's always two sides, right? To the story. So hear people out. We need to learn to listen and to hear people out. And when someone is sharing their point of view, we must listen, ask questions, listen again, ask more questions, listen some more, and then respond. But what we do is listen. We don't hear, but we listen, and we're thinking about what we're going to say, for what is our comeback going to be, and we don't even listen to them. And so we must try to listen, ask questions, listen some more, ask some more questions, listen some more, and then respond. But we're too quick to talk many times. And we're very slow to listen. And so you got to, if you tend to be a hammer, to swat a fly off somebody's head. If you tend to be that hammer, instead of a velvet glove, if you will, get the total picture. Number two, timing. Timing. Look with me in Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 11. The Bible says a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. A word that is spoken at the right what? Time is literally what that means. A word spoken at the right time is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. So we've got to have the right timing when we speak. A lady by the name of Dorothy Neville said this, and I quote, "The real art of conversation is not only to say the right thing in the right place, but to leave unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moment." So true. The real art of conversation is not only to say the right thing in the right place, but to leave unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moments. How many times have we said the wrong thing? Maybe to our spouse. We said the wrong thing. It was not good timing. Anybody beside me ever done that? By the way, it's never a good thing. It's never a good thing. So a word spoken at the right time is like apples of gold and pictures of silver. So of course, I love basketball, I love sports, but I'm a Boston Celtics fan. Any more Celtics fan in the crowd? All right, me and AJ, we're both saved, amen. And so I like the old Boston Celtics, back in the Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson, Danny Ainge kind of days, you know what I mean? And Kevin McHale had this to say about his coach, Casey Jones. He said, after every loss or whenever somebody had taken a bad shot at the end of the game, he'd be the first one to walk over, pat the guy on the back, and say, "Don't worry, we'll get him next time." But Kevin McHale said, but he'd never come up to you after you would do something great and say anything. So Kevin McHale said he asked Casey Jones one night, he said, after you've made the winning basket, you've got 15,000 cheering for you. After Kevin asked him this question, why don't you brag on somebody when they do something good? He said, Kevin, after you've made the winning basket, you've got 15,000 people cheering for you. You've got TV stations coming to talk to you, and everybody's giving you high fives. You don't need me then. You don't need me then. He said, when you need a real friend is when you feel like nobody likes you. And that's when you need somebody. So true. So true. You got to have the right timing. You got to see the total picture. And then number 3, by the way, this kind of section is probably for all of us men, okay? Because we tend to be a hammer, all right? So I'm helping you ladies out a little bit, all right? Maybe some of you ladies tend to be a hammer too, so, you can take it for what it is. But if you tend to be a hammer, here's the third T. You get the total picture, you have the right timing, but then you have the right tone. Sometimes we might say the right thing, but we say it with the wrong tone. Are y'all with me? You know what I'm talking about, right? Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. People often respond to our attitudes and actions more than our words. And so James says, be slow to speak. In other words, tone down. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Maybe we're to listen twice more than we talk. And so when you're talking, you're not learning. Some people love to talk because they know everything, right? And so when you're talking, you're not learning. Solomon said this in Proverbs chapter, let's turn there, Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 19. Solomon said, in the multitude of words, there wanteth not sin. But he that refraineth his lips is what? Wise. In the multitudes of words, there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. Proverbs 17, verse 27, notice that. He that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. In other words, I think what Solomon was saying, if you're smart, you won't talk too much. If you're smart, you won't talk too much. And then Solomon said this in Proverbs 21:23. Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue keepeth his soul from what? Troubles. In other words, he who keeps his mouth shut many times keeps his mouth or keeps his soul from troubles. And so what does Solomon say? Watch your words. Be careful. Somebody said, keep your words sweet because sometimes you may have to eat them. Keep them warm and keep them sweet, for you may have to eat them. And so you gotta get the total picture. You gotta have the right timing. If you tend to be a hammer, you gotta have the right tone. But then the fourth one is the right temperature. The right temperature. What do I mean by that? The size of a problem often changes based on how it is handled. Sometimes we make problems bigger than what they really are. Right? So the size of a problem often changes based on how it is handled. In general, if the reaction is worse than the action, the problem usually increases. If the reaction is less than the action, the problem usually decreases. So it all depends on how we handle the problems. If we react worse than what the problem was, then it's going to escalate. If we handle the problem less than what the problem was, then it's probably going to decrease. So it's all in how we handle the issue. And so if you're a hammer, I've got a suggestion for you. Trade in your hammer for a velvet glove. Trade in your hammer for a velvet glove. Now, and let me give you this because time's already up. Actually, I've got 3 minutes. But if you have a desire to develop a softer touch with people, to be more gentle, if you will, then apply these principles that I want to give you very quickly. I'm just going to give them to you, and we're going to be done. So if you desire to develop a softer touch with people, here's number one. Let the past stay in the past. Let the past stay in the past. By the way, in your marriage, many times our marriages get historical. They're not hysterical, but they're historical, right? We keep score, right? We keep dredging up the past, right? So let the past stay in the past, particularly those of us that are hammers, right? Hey, let the past stay in the past. Hey, resolve an issue when it occurs. And if you resolve it, then if you resolve it and you keep bringing it up, then you're a hammer, right? So trade in that hammer for a velvet glove. Number two, ask yourself the question, is my reaction part of the problem? This is a question I have to ask myself all the time. Because typically when there's problems with me, in my life, whatever problems they may be, I look in the mirror and most of the time it's me. I'm the problem. And so I've got to ask myself, is my reaction part of the problem? So don't make things worse by overreacting. Sometimes we overreact and we make things worse than what they really were. Number three, remember that actions are remembered long after the words are forgotten. Remember that actions are remembered long after words are forgotten. But they'll remember how you reacted. Number four, never let the situation mean more than the relationship. Never let the situation mean more than the relationship. We'll talk about more about that in another principle. But never let the situation mean more than the relationship. By the way, if we took that principle in our marriage, I don't think we would have the issues in marriages that we have today. If we would just simply never let that situation mean more than the relationship. right? Till death do us part, right? Yeah, maybe he was a jerk. Maybe he need to be slapped or, with a skillet over his head. Maybe so. And maybe he deserves it. Maybe you need to do that. No. But just remember the situation is not more important than the relationship. That situation is going to die down. But the relationship's got to continue to live on. Number 5, treat loved ones with an unconditional love. Treat loved ones with an unconditional love. Hey, we don't advertise the sins of people we love any more than we advertise our own. We gossip because we fail to love. And so treat loved ones with unconditional love. And then number 6, admit wrongs and ask forgiveness. Admit you're wrong and ask for forgiveness. The 2 hardest words in the English language is what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Al Capone was quoted to have once said this: you can get farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. You can get farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. Admit you're wrong. Ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness is a whole lot better. And so the question we've got to ask ourselves with this principle is, would others say I overreact to small things in a relationship? Would others say that I overreact to small things in a relationship? I'm going to stop there. It's 8:02. Next Wednesday night, we're going to talk, and we'll take the entire lesson next week on this one principle, because I think it's so important, and I think there's so many things we need to talk about, and that's the elevator principle. The elevator principle. And that principle states this: we can lift people up or we can take people down in our relationships. And that's going to be the elevator principle that we're going to talk about next Wednesday night. Now, any thoughts, comments, anything you want to talk about tonight? Yes, ma'am. What are we under? Number 2, the mirror. So the first person I must know is myself. Is that what you're talking about? The first person to cause me problems is myself? I don't have the outline. I don't have the handout in front of me. Maybe I might have skipped over that. Yeah, I think I probably skipped over that. Yeah, that's the reason you didn't get it. Not because you didn't hear me say it. I didn't say it. Amy? Winning with people. John Maxwell. Yeah, John Maxwell. Winning with people. I would encourage every family to get it and read through it as we're going through it. You okay? Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Sure. That's right. And James really talks about that in the tongue. You know, the tongue is a fire. You know, it may start small. It only takes a spark, right? But that fire can destroy. You know, and he gives a lot of analogies on the tongue because words can hurt. Yeah. So ever who made that statement, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I don't know who came up with that, but I've said that many times too. It's a lie because words do hurt. Anybody else? Tori? She said, speak up louder. Huh? Yeah, I've got good hearing. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm listening very closely. Hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, and that reminds me of the verse that Paul used in Ephesians, where we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers of the rulers of darkness of this world. So, yeah, it's a great point. Anybody else? So your husband or your wife is not really the devil, right? I mean, he's the enemy. Yeah, that's right. All right, next week we'll talk about that last principle, the elevator principle. And so, again, encourage you to get that book if you haven't got it yet. I think it'll be a great time together and will help us in our relationships. All right? Remember the announcement. Brother Toby from Crisis Pregnancy